Hello and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. The Scottish Tory group at Holyrood is even lighter with the defection this week of Graham Simpson MSPs to Reform UK. And Nigel Farage was in hand with a visit to Scotland to boost his party's prospects. So, with Reform UK looking good in Scotland, what's a realistic target for the party going into the Holyrood elections? In just an hour's time, as we're recording this broadcast, we're going to have the two new co-leaders of the Scottish Greens. Will it be Ross Greer and Lorna Slater? Will there be a new direction for the Greens? How will they play the post-election arithmetic at Holyrood next May? And our Tribunes are all back from their summer holidays. They're back at Holyrood next week. So what can we expect between now and Christmas, or perhaps more importantly, what can we expect in the run-up to that election next May? But starting with Reform UK, Alex. Graham Simpson, I suppose if I was thinking who might be tempted by a defection to Reform UK, he might have been quite high up my list.
He would have been very high up the list, Bernard, because you would have been speaking to other Conservative MSPs and asking them the question, well, let us assume for the sake of argument that one or two of your colleagues are going to defect to Reform at some point before the 2026 elections. Who are your number one suspects? And all the little Hercule Poirots and Miss Marples in the Conservative parliamentary group at Holyrood would look around the room and they would say, well, Graham Simpson is top of the list, and various other names would be bandied around. But in any such conversation, you could count on Graham Simpson being mentioned. And lo, it has duly come to pass. He is not, of course, Reform's first MSP, because Michelle Ballantyne defected from the Conservatives to join Reform for a few months before the 2021 Holyrood election. So there is a little bit of previous here. But obviously, Reform UK are now a much greater presence in Scotland than they were then. One of the remarkable things I think we see is that Nigel Farage's previous movements never really gained very much purchase in Scotland. It's true that David Coburn won a seat in the European Parliament for UKIP, a great adornment to the gaiety of the nation in many, many respects. But UKIP, was seen, I think, as an English nationalist party in Scotland, and for fairly obvious reasons, an English nationalist party is always going to struggle for votes in Scotland. One of the interesting things I think about Reform is that it is clearly not seen as an English nationalist party, even though with Farage and some of his colleagues and so on, has many of the same people, many of the same fundamental default attitudes and presumptions as UKIP and Farage's other movements. So, Bernard, why do you think that is? Or, well, first, do you agree with me on that? And secondly, if you do agree, why is Reform seen differently as a definite break from Farage's own past in Scotland? And so you have this situation where Reform are genuinely quite popular in Scotland, in as much as anything up to 1 in 5 people, according to the opinion polls, are currently intending to vote for Reform next year.
I think the answer to that lies in people falling out of love with the mainstream parties. So you're right that when UKIP, who were really branded around the European issue, they were seen essentially as an English nationalist party. I think the view of the Reform is that they are a party which is essentially attempting to break the political system. I mean, if one sets aside for the fact that Farage is a candidate unambiguously of the right. Some people believe he's on the far right. I would prefer the term hard right, in the same way that Jeremy Corbyn is a figure of the left and perhaps the hard left. If we set aside the sort of ideological spectrum and where they stand, one of the pitches that he has is that the political system is broken. And if you have a situation where a lot of Labour voters have no confidence in the Labour Party, a lot of people who have been voting SNP have no real confidence in the SNP or don't like the record in government, and you have a Conservative Party which continues to plummet and in the Scottish context looks less and less relevant, then even in the crowded world of Scottish politics, there is actually room for an insurgency party with admittedly very, very simple messages, and you could say messages which simply perhaps don't stand up in a policy prospectus, which is beyond a joke in many respects. But if people are looking at their lot in life and they're saying, do you know what? It's the entire system that is broken, then the message about a broken political system is a message which transcends the traditional left-right issues, and it transcends the constitutional question, which is why, for example, only this time last week in East Renfrewshire Council area, in Barrhead, there was a local authority by-election which was called to replace a popular Labour councillor who'd passed away, Betty Cunningham, a big figure in that area. Again, no previous support for Reform UK, and they get 22% of the vote. And in that parliamentary by-election, of course, they got 25% of the vote. Commentators who want to look at this through the prism of what I could call normal politics. Are they left? Are they right? Why are people in Scotland voting for a right-wing party? Why are people in Scotland voting for a party which some would still consider to be an English nationalist party? It's the wrong way to analyse what's actually going on. What they're feeding into is a mood that the system is broken. And of course, what they've managed to do is to take the issue of asylum and immigration and brand and market their message around that as an example of a broken politics. And it's resonating, but it's only resonating because the rise of Reform UK is in part a crisis that the voters have in the confidence with the established order and with the established parties.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that. And I think if you look at where Reform is actually gaining its support, I mean, you're right to reference that council by-election in Barrhead. It's only one council by-election. We shouldn't extrapolate too much from it, but it is still significant that Reform can come from nowhere to win nearly a quarter of the vote. And if you look at, it's been the summer holidays, so there's been no opinion polling done in the last couple of months, but there were some polls done in May and June. And there, if you dig into the numbers there, you see that in Scotland, Reform is winning around 25% of the working class vote. C2DE voters. By contrast, it only has around 12% of ABC1 middle class voters. And that tells you something, I think. It tells you that in a strange way, some of the people who responded very well to the Yes campaign in 2014, to some of the messages that were sent by the Yes campaign, which is, this is a moment for change. You have nothing to lose from independence. It is not a gamble for you. How much worse can things get? This is an opportunity to register your discontent with the system and the status quo as it is. That was a powerful message for some voters in 2014. It was a powerful message in parts of the UK for voters in the Brexit referendum in 2016. And I would suggest that even if they're not all exactly the same people, it is the same kind of message that Reform is capitalising on now. And it is a sort of howl of discontent that is not necessarily connected to any specific policies or even ideas that Reform have. Although, it is quite clear that, banging the drum on illegal immigration and forcing other parties, particularly Labour and to some extent the SNP, to, if you like, to conflate legal and illegal immigration is something that is extremely effective as a wedge issue for Farage and Reform. But I'd like to ask you another question, Bernard. Because one often sees this, particularly on social media and so on, and particularly from well-meaning, intelligent, elite status, progressive types and so on, where they say, look at the media putting Nigel Farage on the telly again, or look at the media, look at the newspapers putting Farage and Reform on the front page again. The media are creating this Reform surge. If only the media would do their jobs and so on, then Reform would be nowhere. they only have a handful of MPs. Why are they getting so much more coverage than, say, the Greens or the Liberal Democrats? The Lib Dems, after all, have 72 MPs. Reform only have a handful. And by the end of this parliament and so on, unless they win some by-elections and so on, they'll have even less, because they will all have fallen out with Farage. But nevertheless, there is this sentiment that you see expressed often, that the BBC are responsible for creating Nigel Farage by inviting him on to Question Time and so on, or whatever. And so on. I'd just like to get your views on this. I mean, I have my views, but I'd like to hear what you think about this.
Well, I mean, there's a news agenda. You work in the news industry, and therefore you have to respond to the news agenda. I mean, if we take the issue, for example, around immigration and asylum, and as we keep saying, they're two separate issues, and they shouldn't be conflated. If you have a situation where the government don't appear to be getting on top of an issue like this, and if you like, those who sign up to sort of liberal democratic values basically don't know how to deal with this, because there are international obligations which people accept, that when people come and say that they're the subject of persecution and make an application for asylum, that should be processed and that should be dealt with according to law. Now, if you have a situation where a party is making the running by saying, you know what, we want to opt out of all of our international obligations and we want to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights, and we simply want to turn them all away. There's one very easy way in which you can deal with this. You just simply resile from everything that we've done in the past, and that way you'll cut the numbers. Now, whether or not that is practical, whether or not that stacks up, the one thing that you can say in terms of Reform UK is that their solutions, whether or not they are workable or not, are quite and utterly distinct. They are therefore newsworthy. The other thing is that if the opinion polls are suggesting that there is a mood within the country to support this political party, and that it is therefore currently more resonant than, for example, the Liberal Democrats or the Greens, people who run news organisations have a responsibility to reflect that. If we draw an analogy with a lot of this, this is not a new charge. The charge that the media are behind this is not a new charge. When Labour MPs hemorrhaged in 1981 to form the Social Democratic Party, it was a constant charge for the first 2 years of that party that it was a media creation. You're a media-created party was the jibe that was thrown in the face of Roy Jenkins and David Owen and Bill Rogers and Shirley Williams, and that the media were willing this on. Well, when Jenkins got a good result in Warrington, although didn't win, and won in Hill Head, and they won in Croydon North East, and Shirley Williams won in Crosby, there was a sense at the time that there was a mood behind this new force. You have no option if you're in the news game but to reflect that. But here is perhaps where some people who make that critique have a point. The obligation, if they'll get legitimate coverage for defections and policy announcements and so on, the responsibility is to hold them to account in exactly the same way as you would hold the government and the opposition to account. And one of the reasons why I have said that they will probably not break the mold of politics in the long term is that when we get into the serious business of electing a government and the policies are put up to scrutiny, my own view is that they won't stand up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, newspapers and the press sometimes claim more credit for things than is warranted. There was the famous Sun front page after the 1992 general election that John Major won somewhat against the odds, at least according to the mood at the time, although the opinion polls actually suggested that things were turning against Labour. before that election campaign began. Nevertheless, the famous Sun front page, it was the Sun what won it. And, there are lots of people, particularly on the left, I would suggest, and so on, who are inclined to agree with these sort of things. But it's just not true. Newspapers in particular, which are less significant and less powerful than perhaps they have been in the past because of the changing nature of the media landscape, do not lead public opinion to anything like the extent that some people suggest, nor do they slavishly follow public opinion. It's a sort of awkward and intricate, sometimes fumbling dance that takes place. And newspapers don't really, except in narrow prescribed circumstances, have the possibility to shape public opinion. And those places where it can happen, and so on, when one thinks of, say, things like the Sunday Times is campaigning on thalidomide in the 1970s, that is an area where a newspaper can really make a difference to the public agenda. If one thinks about the famous Daily Mail front page pertaining to the Stephen Lawrence murder, where the Mail accused the young men involved of being murderers and dared them to sue, that was an issue where that had a powerful impact on public opinion and the subsequent course of events, I think. But in more general terms, politically, and so the press doesn't create New Labour. The press doesn't create Nigel Farage. These are other forces at work, and so on. And the media tends to reflect those more than anything else, and often follows public opinion much more than it leads it. And on the question of immigration, I would also point out, I suppose, that some of the questions being asked in the UK and some of the challenges and difficulties the government faces, Keir Starmer's government faces, are are no different to the questions and challenges faced by the government in Italy, in France, in Spain, in Germany, in Sweden, and other countries. This is a pan-European question in many respects, and it'd be a mistake, I think, to view the UK as being exceptional, or in this instance, lying out with the European mainstream. Because questions of migration and asylum and economic migration, etc., are long-standing ones and are going to continue to play a large part in European politics in general, not just in this country. So that's what I would say about that. I suppose the other thing is we haven't actually talked about the impact on poor old Russell Findlay, our friend Russell Findlay, your former colleague, a fellow hack in times gone by, and his Conservative Party. He's now lost Jeremy Green to the Liberal Democrats, Jamie Green to the Liberal Democrats, Jeremy Balfour to independent status, and now Graham Simpson to Reform. That's all within a year. If at least two of those departures were not necessarily a great surprise to those inside the Holyrood village, it's not a good look. It can't be a good thing for Russell Findlay and the Scottish Conservatives, can it?
No, I think of the three, actually, Jeremy Balfour's moving to independent status is actually the much more interesting, because I think there's a degree of respect for this guy across the Holyrood chamber. He's been around in politics a long time. He was an Edinburgh City Councillor. He's been in the trenches a very, very long time in the Conservative cause. In fact, he was in the trenches for the Conservative cause when Russell Findlay wasn't in any political trench at all, or indeed perhaps Russell didn't think terribly much about politics. But if you look at the resignation letter, there were some things in it where there was clearly a frustration on his part, where he was saying things like, our positions on things appear to be coming from unelected and inexperienced advisors. And the minute I read that line, I thought, yes. I have no difficulty in believing that, because I've seen this particular movie many times before. The other, I think, problem is that if you are someone who's in the Scottish Conservative Party and you want to remain in politics, Politics is your livelihood. Politics is your career. Politics is your vacation. And you're looking at what's going on. And by the way, the underlying moves towards reform and some of the issues which are driving that are still going to be with us next May. So the only question is going to be, how high are they going to go? But if you're a Conservative and you're thinking, this has the feel of a sinking ship, and there's the possibility that you will lose your seat, some others must be asking, should I? Should I be going? Should I be jumping? Because my friend, the late Labour MP, Dr. Norman Godman, once said to me, there is nothing more ex than an ex-politician. One day the mailbag is there and it's full of invitations and everybody wants to know your views on all sorts of things, and you're lobbied and canvassed and you do a job of advocacy. And the day that you lose your seat, nobody wants to know your opinion, nobody canvasses you, nobody is interested in your point of view. And perhaps more importantly, depending on what you did in another life, nobody is interested in employing you. And there comes a point in all of this where, in a very, very real sense, people will be asking themselves, what do I do for a living? What do I do for a living? And am I going to continue to hitch my wagon to a sinking ship, or do I take a chance with something else? And just finally, the Scottish elections are an entirely free hit for Nigel Farage, an entirely free hit, because the ability to make an impact to the next UK general election is not going to be dependent on the outcome of what happens in Scotland, which would be widely viewed by people as tough terrain for Reform UK. And yet it doesn't appear that it's all that tough. And unlike the Westminster situation, he has a proportional voting system to fall back on next year. So he's going to get representatives. And the only thing that getting representatives at Holyrood will do is give him a further bounce. Although long term, I still say, just like the SDP, he will ultimately fail to break the mold of politics, because although the asylum and immigration issue seems to be cutting through in a way that no other issue is, it won't cut through forever.
Well, and it may be something of a summer storm that blows itself out, possibly, and that is one possibility. There are, of course, others. Yeah, I mean, you're right on politicians. On the journey from rooster to feather duster is very, very quick and brutal. But the Jeremy Balfour thing is interesting. I mean, you're right in say, Balfour suggested that the Conservatives were becoming in danger of being enthralled to reactionary policies and so on. Well, there are some Conservatives I know who say, well, if we can't be reactionary, what is the point of the Conservative Party? But it's also interesting because Jeremy Balfour was also a name that was sometimes whispered as a potential defector to reform. And now he, at this point, hasn't chosen to do that. And when you looked at his resignation letter and so on, he was deploring the Conservatives' attitudes to things like welfare spending, where there's a suggestion that welfare spending needs to be controlled and the rate of increase certainly needs to be reduced, and longer term, the overall level of welfare spending probably needs to be reduced. That is, something I think that most Conservative MSPs would agree with. And Jeremy Balfour, who's of course disabled himself, takes a rather different view on that and comes at it from a different perspective. And it was interesting too, I think, to see people like Liz Smith, who is also standing down from Holyrood next year, saying that, we should all think upon, the things that Jeremy is saying in his resignation letter and the reasons for his departure and so on. So that was, if you like, a shot across Russell Findlay's bows from the moderate wing of the Conservative Party group at Holyrood as well. And so it seems to me that poor old Russell Findlay is taking fire from his right and from his left, and his centre is falling apart too. And so this really leaves him with little option but to counterattack. But with what sort of troops he can muster, I am not entirely sure at the moment, because this is clearly a season where within the Conservative Party at Holyrood, where every rat still afloat must consider his or her options.
Yeah, and I think that the issue is that for reform, I think that they will have a good election next May. The only question is how good. I think for the Conservatives, they will have a bad election. The only question is how bad, or perhaps even how catastrophic. Moving along to another party, what will the Greens do next year? I suspect that they will return broadly what they have. But they will be doing so with a new leadership team, or not an entirely new leadership team. I mean, the result, I think, is now out in about half an hour. I'm sort of slightly assuming that it's going to be Ross Greer and Lorna Slater.
It's going to be very embarrassing if it isn't it?
But I'm assuming, I'm not predicting. In any case, whoever it is, I mean, here's a genuine question. Does it actually matter, in a sense, who are the co-leaders of the Scottish Greens? I suspect not, because I think that if you sign up to an environmental agenda, I think if you sign up to an alternative economic model, I think if you sign up to a series of messages that say decommission the North Sea, we're not interested in going for economic growth, and you take an unambiguously left-wing agenda in terms of a human rights agenda and defence and security and international affairs, the kind of political glue that binds the Greens together and which finds an echo out in the electorate, you're going to vote for that prospectus, irrespective of who the co-leaders are. Although I do think at election time, particularly when it comes to things like these leaders' debates, Patrick Harvie in particular, and again, he's a minority taste because it's a minority of people who actually vote Green. He nevertheless was an effective communicator at selling that agenda. I think Ross Greer is a pretty effective communicator as well. He also is a bit fresher faced. He's a newer generation. So I suspect that the Greens will broadly next year hold what they have in what could be, will certainly be a rainbow parliament of political minorities, where even two dancing to a tune, or even three, might not hit the magic number of 65.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be surprised if the Greens lost too many seats next year. Although, again, the presence of reform and reform's emergence complicates things on the regional list significantly, because it means that, essentially those votes are being divided by, on the regional list, are being divided by 7 or 6 rather than 5. So it's possible that, the Greens might lose out or be squeezed on the regional list a little bit. The other thing that I think is quite interesting about the Greens is I mentioned earlier about how reform's support comes, 2/3 or so of reform's support comes from working class communities and working class voters. The Greens are the complete opposite. 2/3 of their support comes from middle class voters, and 1/3 from, if you like, the fabled ordinary working people of Scotland. And, that's fine. There are plenty of people who sneer at these things and sort of say, oh, middle class, who cares? And so, they don't know anything about the real world and all the rest of it. Well, half the country is middle class. Half the country is ABC1. And it doesn't strike me that middle class voices or middle class votes, and I declare an interest as a member of the middle class, of course, are necessarily inherently less valuable or less worthy than working class voices and votes. And that is something I think that we should bear in mind. But the Greens, the Greens are in certain respects a home for people who, if they lived in England, would be extremely happy with Jeremy Corbyn. That is a perfectly defensible, if in my view, entirely erroneous political perspective. And there's an opportunity for the Greens, particularly with the SNP being led by John Swinney and with, for the time being, Kate Forbes as his deputy. There is an opportunity clearly for the Greens to carve out a niche to the left of the SNP, to the left of the Labour Party as well. And so that if you are in favour of independence, if you see yourself as a radical, as a progressive, and so on, there is an opportunity there for the Green Party to tap into your support. And so particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also in other parts of the country too. And so strategically, it seems to be that the Greens are actually placing themselves in the correct position on the political spectrum from their own point of view. Again, this has nothing to do with whether one agrees with Green positions on rent controls and other issues and capitalism and so on. But from their point of view, it seems to be quite logical. And to that extent, I think Patrick Harvey can justly claim to have been one of the most influential and substantial Scottish political figures of the last 15 years. Taking the Greens into government was a good thing for the Green Party. It's not quite so clear to me that it was a good thing for the SNP, but it was clearly a good thing for the Greens, and they were able to have significant influence across a whole range of government policies that they would not have been able to have had Patrick Harvey not had the courage in some ways to take them into government. And so I think he departs the stage as a significant figure. And I agree with you that Ross Greer is the obvious replacement, and from a communications point of view, is probably more effective than any of the alternatives that there could have been. He's better known. There is something weird about the sort of Bears Den Che Guevara act, but nevertheless, there we have it. There is obviously some voters who are sort of impressed by this and buy it, but will it really make a huge difference to the Green fortunes? No, because political leadership is also, and this is something I think that we fail to stress often enough. And so, political leadership is important, but it's not always important, and it's often important at the margins. And if you're a minority, a small party, then you need an effective leader who can get your message across, certainly. But you also need to recognize that, in general, the fundamental aspects of elections are decided by underlying conditions and so on, and they are influenced by political leadership, but they are not made or transformed by political leadership.
I can't get the image of the Bears Den Che Guevara out of my head. All I would say, Ross, is don't go to Bolivia for your holidays. Don't go to Bolivia for your holidays. I think that
maybe he's Mulgai. I can't remember. Is it Mulgai or Bears Den? I mean, there's a difference or a distinction. One of those difference.
It's one of those dreary areas.
You mean nice?
No, I mean boring. There were friends of mine who were threatening to move to Bears Den, and I threatened to throw myself in front of the removal van. I thought they'd been a suicide pact within 6 months. Anyway,
what a loss to Scottish political journalism that would have been, and over such a trivial cause. For the want of a nail, a kingdom was lost, etc., etc.
It was class warfare on my part, I have to tell you. Anyway, we should probably move on. We've been going for half an hour, and our tribunes. They've not quite been putting their feet up, but some of them have during the last couple of months of recess. So we should sort of look ahead to what will happen between now and the new year. I think this is going to be a phony parliamentary term, in the sense that you start with the election, you work back the way. And when you work back the way, there are a number of rules which most governments seem to have. One is, don't do anything which is stupid or crackers. Don't do anything which is controversial in terms of any legislation, because you don't want to be mired in controversy in the run-up to the election. Thirdly, in terms of the budget which you put forward in the run-up to that election, make sure that there are a couple of headline-grabbing announcements in it which will form the basis of a policy platform at the election, where you can eyeball the electors and say, this is what we have done for you in government. So I would almost say, forget the legislative programme insofar as it exists. I've probably forgotten most of the pieces of legislation that were announced because they were instantly forgettable. The only real event of, I think, significance will be the budget later on in the year. And of course, what Rachel Reeves as Chancellor does in her budget is going to be absolutely critical for the Scottish Government's room for manoeuvre for giving away free things in the run-up to the election next year. So as far as I'm concerned, their mantra will be steady as you go, don't do anything controversial, don't do anything stupid, hope that the Reeves budget doesn't deliver any kind of austerity in terms of spending cuts, which limits your room for manoeuvre, and try and get the budget right in the run-up to to the election.
Well, I mean, despite that that intimation that absolutely nothing of interest is going to happen in the next few months and so on, I do implore listeners to stick with us as we go through the build up to next May's election. I mean, in broad terms, I think you're right though, Bernard. I mean, the election shadow is very significant. And, I mean, John Swinney has been very quiet this summer. Anna Sawar has sort of disappeared this summer and so on, and fair play to him. There's no reason for him to be in the public eye during the summer recess when people aren't really paying a huge amount of attention to politics. But Labour clearly have a lot of work to do in the run-up to next May. I think an awful lot of things will be punted beyond the election. So to take one example of that, the ongoing financial crisis at Dundee University and the threat of layoffs there amongst staff as the university has to balance its books and resettle things after various bailouts and so on. I think that will be punted beyond the election and so on. There'll be a suggestion that no, we don't want to have 300 people losing their jobs in Dundee before the election. So there is no need to be hasty about this, for example. And that's just one example of an area where I think more broadly anything that is controversial will be punted into the long grass. And you're right, the budget will be the only parliamentary vote of any great significance, because of course John Swinney and Shona Robertson will require support from some opposition MSPs to pass that budget. Last year Labour abstained on the Scottish budget, and the Liberal Democrats were happy to vote for it. I cannot see Labour abstaining this time. It seems to me obvious that Labour will have to vote against the budget, albeit that will then allow the SNP to say Labour have voted against, nurses and apple pie and other lovely things. But fundamentally, in the run-up to an election, the opposition parties are not in a position where they can be, if you like, charitable or extend a friendly hand to the First Minister. And so the budget process will be, I think, possibly quite fraught this year. But that is the only significant parliamentary event on the timescale right now, I think. And the question remains, does Scottish politics enter a new phase or not next year? And the rise of reform, again, complicates matters because it becomes much, much harder to see how you can put together an election-winning team. Nobody, I think, at present expects the SNP to win an overall majority. Nobody at present, and of course things can change, really expects the SNP to come to some sort of agreement with the Green Party, either before or after the election. And that therefore means that lots of things are fluid and uncertain, except perhaps this, that everybody in Scotland is a minority. And so in that sense, we are a little bit closer back to the 1999 and 2003 and even 2007 elections than more recently ones where, yes, the SNP is likely to be the largest party, but there is a huge difference between being the largest party on 33% of the vote and the largest party on 43 or 47% of the vote.
Yeah, I think the analogy is actually with the 2003 election.
Mm-hmm.
That was the Rainbow Parliament. If you remember that there was a shot in the arm for the Scottish Greens, the Scottish Socialists, of course, before they imploded, did very well. There was the emergence of independence. But given where the polls are, I mean, I think there is a genuine issue, about whether or not I was having dinner with a former senior Labour figure last night, and we were just sort of talking through the arithmetic. And if the largest party has a tally of seats which falls around 40 or just below 40, and let's say, for example, it is the SNP.
I think the SNP will have more than that, but.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, if we're talking sort of 42 and you're looking at 9, 10 Greens and maybe 10 Lib Dems, you are still short. You're still short of the magic number of 65. And of course, the Greens are always unpredictable. I don't think you're going to have a formal coalition after the election. I think it will be a very loose confidence and supply motion with in the circumstances where the SNP have to rely on the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, probably with the Greens and the Liberal Democrats writing the budget. As the
God help us.
quite, there may well indeed be, for the first time in the entire devolved era, a genuine issue about governability. Is there the will to keep anyone in power, and might the wheels actually come off? So all of this chat around the numbers is chat with a purpose, because it does, in my view, raise issues about the stability of the next government and whether or not that government will actually last the entire Parliament.
Well, there you have it, folks. You heard it here first. Scotland as the new Belgium. We shall see. There is a long way to go before then. So this is only the beginning. Next week is only the beginning of the new parliamentary term. The elections aren't until May. But it is true, I think, that almost everything that happens at Holyrood and in Scottish politics more generally will be seen through the prism of the May election from this point onwards. And no political party is going to want to make any kind of significant decisions or calculations without considering the impact of those decisions on their electoral prospects next May. But we will obviously be following every step and turn of the exciting journey to Holyrood 2026, and we hope that you'll be with us. But for the time being, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.